Hey guys, it's Wingfors here. You know they say that every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, God kills a kitten? Well, this is Foreign's channel. And every time you pick Hanzo in ranked, Foreign kills a seagull.
There was an error with the intro to this episode, and so I will just explain basically what Peak said in introducing himself. Our guest is Peak, and he is a coach in Overwatch. He's been there since the very early days of Overwatch. He was actually coaching the Misfits team way back. Then he coached that team called Arc 6, the one that had like XQC, Dante, Space, Costa, a bunch of players you'll be aware of. Also the Renegades lineup when that was around, and more recently, Envious into the Dallas Fuel. So since you've been there from the early days, and Overwatch is a game that's been through many different meta shifts. Obviously, it actually took a long time before people even understood the compositions to play and how actually the meta game works within it. Let me ask you this question then, because the topic for this show is going to kind of be, what type of game is Overwatch? Like, how do we model it? How do we think about it? Because, I mean, this is an area where even the way the game was marketed is a bit confusing, you know, because on the one hand, it's an FPS game, but then it has elements that actually aren't really FPS concepts, you know, like holding a certain area. I guess it's kind of like capture the flag logic in a way, you know, that's kind of worked in there. But then obviously the hero element and the composition element is much more in line with a MOBA or an arts game like Dota 2, League of Legends, Hon, those games people know. So how do you actually in your mind, how do you think of it as a game?
It used to be much different from what it is right now. But right now I see the game as a game based off tempo, basically. And you want to work with the most productive elements in your team, or most productive people, rather than focusing on limiting the loss, or how do you would say it, in a fight, compared to old Overwatch, where you would bet everything on one fight or one game, one match. In Overwatch League, it's a lot more about all the games and all the fights and all the matches, and you want to be as efficient as possible and as a team. So that's how I look at it. It's by efficiency, optimizing processes in game, and just limiting the mistakes.
Okay, so then to contrast that to earlier on then, how was that concept different earlier? Like when you're having a team fight before, what's different to now in terms of like lack of efficiency, I guess?
It's mostly the format for matches and so on, because if you take Apex as an example, you had weeks or maybe months to prepare for a match. You have, for example, the Atlantic Showdown. You have 2 weeks or something before a match there, and those 2 weeks is enough time to prepare big like strategies. You have time to actually go into the minds of your opponents rather than focusing on yourself. And that's the biggest difference, I think, because you ended up getting stuck in, what shuts down the enemy rather than what snowballs us.
Okay. What do you think, Yiska? How do you model it as a game?
Well, fundamentally, I once did a video about Overwatch from first principles, and what I said then was, which I still believe, like if you're starting from scratch, basically, it's a game of space and time mostly, meaning that you need to control space, and then you need to do it in a certain time frame. Obviously, it's different across the map types, which makes it even more complex, if we're being honest. Then I wonder, is there? And I don't think there's another esports that mixes up the game modes and therefore the win conditions that come with them as hard as Overwatch did, which in itself might pose more challenges, even though you could argue that it's just a new feature of the map, and the ultimate objective rarely really plays a huge role in comparison to, winning fights and therefore gaining advantages. Though I would say that if you look at it statistically, there are actually teams that tend to, for instance, get more attacks out per minute than other teams. So they use in their time that more effectively. And I think, for example, NYXL was like that, where during their prime, their win rate also didn't seem to suffer from that too much. But yeah, basically that is my most fundamental conception of Overwatch. Now, how it's being played, I definitely would echo the at least from the outside, what we're seeing is that unless it was now in the playoffs, obviously, it was rather rare that we saw these curveball strategies that were obviously tailored towards one specific strategy that the opponent was pulling off. And if it was that way, was quite obvious that it was only ever going to happen against one team that specific week. And then if you were a team that was unfortunate enough to have back-to-back games, basically, I'm still not sure how big of an impact that had. But some teams, for instance, London had a rough schedule that had a bunch of trap games, I would say. Fusion the same, by the way, which is funny because those obviously ended up being the the finals teams.
Okay. Right, what do you think about that aspect then, Peak, when he tried to sort of like figure out like a principle of the game, like it's about like space that you control, but then obviously time is a factor in some of the game modes?
I agree with it. It reminds me a lot like trading. You trade currencies basically, where space and time is two forms of currencies, and then you have abilities as well as another form of currency. And I pretty much agree with it, because when it's this divided by space, you also have different areas that are more valued than others. For example, easy one is high ground versus low ground, but it's not always the case that high ground automatically wins you anything. So you can still make value out of bad trades, but in the end, I see it as a form of hierarchy, basically, and or sort of economy system. I don't know how to explain it, but form of trades for you gain value in other ways.
I mean, that's the tricky part about Overwatch, where sometimes, especially if you're not that much into the specific map or into the matchup and how the ultimate economy works out, you can have eco pushes which really go very well, and you obviously still have to lose that fight because you're just up against a bunch of ultimates. But if you, for instance, get out like the support ultimates, that's a huge win, even though perceived by probably even medium tier skilled fans, they would say, well, you lost the fight, so obviously that's bad. When in reality, you maybe could have gotten like, I don't know, 2 support ultimates because your Winston and your Tracer coordinated well on the Zen and then forced out a trance or whatever. And in that regard, I think this also, I think we saw even a little bit of a development in that regard in all teams pretty much across the season, when I think really that concept, and if I'm not mistaken, or I did a video back then of especially about that specific combo of Winston and Tracer forcing out these eco pushes, that was rather introduced by GC Busan back in the day, where they tried to get these eco pushes out. Now, obviously, then we heard before that Lunatic High had like these ideas that, for instance, you pull a Genji Blade just to get trance out and whatever to maximize the fight rate, win rate after that. Now, did you like measure out these like trade-offs, and did you have like solid heuristics to give to your players during the season where you were like, okay, this, you get this out of your eco push, that's basically success, and you can then set up this way? And if you did this somehow transition over the season depending on the meta?
So I started out doing that with taking the Soul match as an example. We went into Junkertown, Anubis, etc., where we essentially couldn't play dive, and so we had to figure out other ways to get as much value so that we can beat other teams. And that's how we started to map out, for example, Rissa Hog combos. We even experimented some with Mei Hog and Rissa just to try and snowball even harder. And I started mapping out different combos, different timings you can do, and what's required to get value. And if it's not, if the criterion aren't met, then you just waste the push or the combo. And in the start it was easy, but it's also very hectic to like maintain the muscle memory for those combos and those timings that we set out, and over time they faded away when we stopped doing them, or if games went really bad, so we couldn't execute anything. And then it just fell off completely, and we ended up switching strats and so on.
But what is your take in general? Because I know, for instance, the story of London was that, for instance, in stage 1, I think they still had some very planned out strategies, and then across the season they tried to keep that up. They even did it, like people say that they've somehow completely switched and they don't have any hard strategies anymore. I don't think that's particularly true, because I still saw pretty like standard routing for them that they kept repeating also in terms of the comps they played, but still like what the players said was that they were much more fluid now in their understanding of the game, and they would switch much more. Is that a meta thing, or do you think that should have ideally been the case for the entire season, and that's the ideal way to play Overwatch?
I think it should have been the ideal case for the whole season, because I think every team realized this, because I think almost every team started with very set strats, like very planned out, and maybe not positions planned out, but you have exact counters, exact comps, ults, and all that. But most teams didn't have set routes. I think only like kind of vague where you move and so on. And after that, they had designed stuff they want to do in the fight, mid fight, after fight, etc. I think it's much better to just give 20% of that to the players, where you plan the opening to a fight or the route to a fight. And then, because the game is way too fast and way too fluid to be able to map out what mid-fight will look like. And it's more reliable to give that to players who already have the intuition to deal with it. And instead, you want to focus on the small details, for example, small tweaks on a flank and so on that might shut down tendencies from a different team, rather than focusing on everything possible. Yeah.
Because that's one of the things I noticed as an outsider that was very interesting, is because since so many of the pro players in Overwatch were coming from Team Fortress 2, I actually noticed that it's them who thought that the game was played like Team Fortress 2. It wasn't that there was any indication in the game itself that you should play it exactly like that. Because one of the things that baffled me in the early days, someone who watched a decent amount of MOBA games, was that it took Western teams so long to figure out the concept of ult economy, and that they would just literally use them every time they were up. And they would just take the fight and think, if we just shoot these guys in the head though, we kill them, and then it's like, the amount of bad fights they took, and times where they'd already blown an ult, and it's like, right, you should really hold, wait till it comes back again, then push. And instead they would just attack as though they were waves going onto Normandy Beach or some mad sort of strategy like that. So what that actually showed early on was that even pro players had a different conception of the game. And so one of the things I wanted to ask about in this sense, in terms of Overwatch as a game, is the FPS component of it does make it different to MOBAs, in as much as, yes, MOBAs are about the comp, and then things like, which ult did we get out of the opponent, and what do we have left, and what's the cooldown difference between certain items. But because there isn't as much variance in how you aim within the context of that, because most MOBAs have on-click abilities, auto attacks, you actually have to move the character with the same icon that actually attacks, it's far more limited mechanically. Whereas when you actually have an FPS component, even if you in theory have the right comp and you have the right timing and you even know the person to attack, you can fuck it up entirely, or you can make something that isn't even supposed to be that efficient work even better than it should, because you have the best DPS player or the most amazing what do you think in that sense? Because it must make it tough to coach the game and figure out these kind of flow charts of what to do, right?
It definitely affects coaching really heavy. You can get anything from players who are firm believers in you need to have set strategies, and you have one strategy that beats everything else. Then you also have players that just require the intro to a fight, and then they can take care of themselves completely. And the players that can take care of themselves completely are the players that are the strongest, and also the players that can react, that have strong eye reflexes, for example, those players become superstar DPS players, for example. I think DK, for example, from Kongdu. I just saw him like play in the finals versus Runaway. And even though Kongdu didn't win, you can see exactly how he aims and how well he reacts to targets. Just no matter how much clutter, a player like him will become superstar just because of his eye reflexes, for example.
Yeah. I completely agree. And he actually gave me, I had a tweet about this, like he gives me the Fleta and Prophet vibes, even though Prophet is a little bit different, I feel, than other star players, where I feel like he doesn't really, in the situation, like try to figure out the way to go through it, but he maps out what is supposed to happen much more. And the way to beat Prophet is basically make the situation so confusing that he couldn't have possibly conceived of that situation. And honestly, his mechanics aren't the best in the Overwatch League. He's good mechanically. He's not nuts, right? So what you will be seeing from Prophet is something like he will just full clip. He will blink around a corner, expect an opponent to go there, and then he will like spray half a clip, almost 3/4 of a clip from Tracer into a wall just because he thought, someone should be there, or maybe he looked over to Gesture's screen and saw someone in that corner like a moment ago. And I think that makes him a very unique player that is sort of very interesting that this style can work on DPS.
Well, those are actually two concepts that do come from FPS games. So, for example, in Counter-Strike, we have a concept called the pre-fire, where when you're going to peek a certain corner, if there's like an 80% chance a guy stands at that one spot, sometimes you fire before you've even actually seen if he's there, because if you do, then if he is there, you basically win the aim duel, even though technically like neither of you had an aim duel because you didn't know someone was there. And then the other concept is, this is a very old concept from Quake, believe it or not, which is that people would think, because Quake is such a mechanical game and aim can dominate the game so much, they would think it's about being the best aimer. But by the time you got even a few years into Quake, it wasn't at all about being the best aimer, because all the really good players knew the most efficient angle and timing to set up the shot. So they made all of their shots easier. And so, for example, a weapon like the railgun, which could be very, very oppressive, they were all able to hit a certain percentage because they just wouldn't take shots that were bad shots, or they wouldn't go into an angle without any knowledge of where the opponent, they would actually they would make it look like they had good aim, but they didn't really. They didn't have the sort of aim where they could have just walked out and known nothing and spun halfway across their screen and killed the guy. They were just setting every shot up. So it became easy for them.
No. I mean, that's keep going.
Yes, doesn't it also get into their heads, both in good and bad ways, when they succeed with it? When they almost autopilot and take the muscle memory, they have and fire at the angles and get the shots. And also when they miss, some players, that doesn't discover, that they aim in that way. Did it go to their head a lot, like in Overwatch, or where some players struggle for a month or two, or
that's the time of discussion, isn't it? I mean, basically, what he's describing is I guess if you would relate it to CS:GO, it would be the discussion of being on, right?
Yeah,
with ops and that's actually something I wanted to ask you as well. Do you feel that the concept of being on, so to explain that is, for instance, in CS, you sometimes would give some player the ARP, and if he feels it that day, you could maybe structure a strategy around that. And it seems, I remember almost for every, even mediocre player in the pro scene in CS, that he had that one match where he completely went off, right? And then you probably should use that. Is that possible in Overwatch? Can you say, for instance, well, you probably shouldn't play Widowmaker here, but on this day, Timmy would just can take over a game?
I would say, yeah, you can definitely do that. I wanted to mention it during echo pushes when you talked about that when you do echo pushes, you can have these pushes where if you have a Widow and she hits 2 headshots, you basically don't need to use any ults at all, and you still win. And it has happened, and it will happen again in matches.
Yeah. And how important is teamwork in that regard? Like, can you then completely change the synergy of how people work together, and then is it hard to like contribute of these individual plays in that case?
I think it might be hard to look at it in Overwatch, because most players, most teams, most fans, and so on, they would think in a blame game way when they look at superstar DPS compared to a support play or something. And the way I look at it, if the DPS, even if it's not a star DPS, if he is selfless, but not in a way where he gives up all the resources, it's more in a way where he doesn't blame teammates when they lose, or he owns up to his mistakes and so on. If he wins through that, the team around him will win as well, because they will come up to his level, And a good player will be able to make bad players better, but bad players will never be able to make a good player even better, if that makes any sense. And these players that might get too arrogant, maybe, or too full of themselves, whether it's Overwatch or some other game, it's a continuous lesson they have to teach themselves to be on a fine line of balance. And I don't know if that can answer it, but yeah.
Do you have any experience with other games before Overwatch?
I used to compete in Heroes of the Storm.
I guess that's because I was meaning to ask how important the performance of a star player feels in comparison to other esports. Now, obviously, HOTS is probably the game where the star players have the least impact, I would think, right?
There was a period where you could just pick a hero and insta-shot a whole team, but it was nerfed, and I moved on after that. But I think I have a background in CS 1.6, but I never competed professionally. But I would say being the star player in Overwatch is pretty much being the star in any field that has a team in it. If you're a programmer in a software development team, or if you're in a construction company, whoever does the most has the same type of feelings. Maybe not to the same extent, but you can see a form of burden, having to deal with low productivity sometimes. You have motivation that you have to sometimes lend out to others, and it's a draining spot for sure.
Yeah. How does that relate to roles? So if let's pose as hypothetical, right? So you get to time travel to the beginning of Overwatch of the Overwatch season, Overwatch League season, and basically you're given the option to reallocate skill points for all your roles, right? So you basically can say, I want to have the best tank player in the league, and I want to have the best DPS player or the best flex support. If you wanted to win the Overwatch League, how would you reallocate resources in that regard? Or in other terms, what do you think was the most important role in terms of carry potential over the season?
I would say the tanks, the main tank, and whoever is a DPS or flex DPS, flex tank that is paired together with that tank, because they control basically the pace in the fight for their own team. And if you put a lot of resources into controlling the team fight, you can limit what an opponent does. Even if you can't do much, you have more space to do more attempts at taking shots at enemies and so on. Just increasing the amount of opportunities is what I would look at. And I'm not sure how many points I can distribute, but I would definitely go for the main tank and also the main support, because the main support, for example, now the Mercy has been really key to a lot of teams.
I mean, there is a logic behind that, because obviously the concept of a tank in any team game is like peel for your carries so that they have more chance to do damage, to actually kill the opponent without being killed themselves. And so if you have a really good tank, obviously that creates... It means in theory your DPS doesn't have to work as hard as the other DPS. So if you then also have a star DPS as well, you're going to be creating extra space for that guy to go even more ham. So that makes total logical sense. And obviously anyone who looked at the season can see how many teams had an amazing DPS player, an amazing tank, and went deep in the playoffs. I mean, about the only one I can think of that wasn't heavily based around their tank was probably the Fusion. I mean, you know, most people didn't pick Sado or any of these guys as like potential best tank in the league, but every other playoff team pretty much was based around a really strong tank, really strong DPS, at least one.
It's also easier to upgrade the DPS in terms of teaching or learning, just from scrims, like copying others. It's way easier on DPS than on tank and support.
Do you think that's why we saw most substitutions over the season in terms of plug and play on the DPS role? Because it's easier?
I wouldn't say it because of it's easier. Obviously, I don't know what happened in other teams, but I know it can be anything from stress to purely logical reasons. Many teams like face difficulties in terms of staying as balanced as they were when they entered Overwatch League. And sometimes you have to do a substitution for that reason as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So, here's a question then. Since you were talking before about the fact that when you have a practice, like every fight's not going to play out the exact same way every time. So you can't really know how the middle of the fight's going to look. For example, you know, you can give someone the basic concept like, here's who we want to engage on, or here's the ultimate we want to be blown before we do X, Y, and Z. You know, those parts make sense. But how do you actually take things, for example, where, say, a top Overwatch League team introduces a style of play or a specific combo or composition, and it's really good? How do you actually break that down so that a team that's not as good can implement it? Because, you know, I would imagine it's going to be tough to know, well, how much of that is that, you know, this DPS player hit some amazing shots, or someone had an amazing intuitive sense for when to go in a fight. I mean, basically, the point I'm getting to here is even the amazing Overwatch League team might not have had all of that really planned out and kind of like mapped as to what they do, you know? They might have just had a sense of what to do. So how do you reverse engineer something like that?
I can take the Orisa Hog comp that we ran in the Fuel a lot as an example. It's still being ran on, for example, Anubis. And the way we came up with it on Anubis was we didn't favor Winston and Diva as much. And we also had Sick Widow. And Widow was pretty strong and still is. And so when I did preparations for our first matches and so on, I started thinking, how can we get the most out of our players? And so I had filled up all the roles, you know, with Rissa, Hog, Mercy, Zen, whatever we had. And then we had one DPS spot left, and it was the missing Widow. And then I just started thinking of once when Immortals played Widow on Anubis, where Karib went Widow instead of Zen, and it was just a coincidence for me to discover that. But then to develop that style and also teach it to other teams, you need to strip like the elements of that composition and also the idea you had, or what triggered you to want to do that comp, like an onion basically. And the way I do it is taking heroes, isolate them, and then isolating their abilities and comparing them to the environment they're in, and then also what can the enemies do, because the enemies can essentially pick the same comp, right? And when you want to optimize, you have to test the comp. When you fail with it, I think it was maybe mid-stage, or no, mid-season, that I also realized we don't really use Mercy bulk as we should, for example. Instead of using it during a fight or at the end of a fight, you should engage with it, because the duration of it is insane, you can do a lot with it. You can avoid damage with it, and you can especially damage boost the whole team. And then I started thinking about, damage boosting with Orisa ult, and it just like snowballs into more train of thoughts. But it always stems from the when you break down the abilities by themselves. And I try to look more at basic abilities rather than old combos and so on, because it's much easier to predict how a fight can start with basic abilities.
How often, so for instance, Benchmob, I think, was very observant in this when he realized that the NYXL always used their Widowmaker ultimate when the opponent used theirs. Because basically, I guess the premise was, our aim is better anyway. The only way you could outsnipe us is having the jump on us by having a Widowmaker ult up while we don't have one up. So let's just mirror that. How much of that is still uncovered in common parlance? Like how many, tiny mini games or tiny, like machinations of if this happens, then this happens. How much is uncovered to the community, do you think?
I would say a lot of it is still to be discovered, because it varies extremely from player to player. You could have a player like AKM, for example. He's very methodical, and then if you would pop walls against him, he pops walls, and you can see each other, and then you plan very quickly and very good plans, how to rotate and so on, and make use of your walls and confusing the enemy, whatever you want to do. But then you also have players like Taimo, you have players like, let's say, Carpe, that use the walls just to like gain more momentum and more tempo, because they hit their shots and they build more walls. So a player who actually hits shots, or doesn't have to be headshots, they can have the intention to farm walls, they can have the intention to just pop walls because it's nothing. There's like some players that value walls as nothing, basically, when it's one of the strongest ultimates.
It is, yeah. Statistically, I believe in most scenarios it ranks among top 3, the other 2 being Orisa ult, which is significantly less up, and obviously Junkrat's higher, and that depends on the map. But yeah, just in terms of if this is used in a fight, you win the fight, Widowmaker ult is one of the highest ranked.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the areas where, I'll give some crossover analogy to League of Legends, for example. So because in every pro game, you're seeing similar champions in League of Legends, characters, heroes in Overwatch being used. And the casters, obviously, in a lot of scenarios, will even say the name of the hero rather than the player sometimes, because it's very hectic on screen. They want you to immediately know who they're talking about. Not everyone's going to have memorized the names of like some of the Korean players, for example. I get why they do it, but I do think sometimes people get trapped into the mentality of just thinking about like how this hero interacts with this hero instead of like the player who's piloting that hero and what he can do. Because it's actually something that at certain times in League of Legends, for example, there were pro teams in the West who would actually brag like, oh, I just actually don't even think of the opponent I'm playing. I think of the champion and how that matches up against my champion and what I can do against it. And it's like, okay, I'll give them a little bit of slack. League of Legends, like I said, because it's not as mechanically demanding, to a degree, there's a logic to that, 2 champions are going to have similar interactions. But even then, that usually was a story which would always have like, the famous last words quality of like, you tried to do that against like Faker on the same champion. Whereas, yeah, unsurprisingly, your mid lane matchup against some guy who was from like Canada was a bit easier when you were playing versus that champion, as opposed to like the best player ever who was absurdly good. So in the same sense, I wonder in Overwatch in that sense and coaching, how much actually the top teams are putting into player tendencies. Because I know from sports where individual stars can have a massive impact, like the NBA, NHL. In these sorts of team sports, they put a massive amount of coaching for defensive players into here is what the star player does in terms of tendencies, and here's exactly what I want you to do to try and neutralize it. Like, not like shut him down, like, you're not going to stop him from scoring or killing. But the idea is like, he's more comfortable playing on this part of the map, so let's try and push him into this other area. Or if he's going to kill you, try and like push into him so then he has to pull back. Concepts like this tended to be very key in those games because they understood that player is going to get so much more out of his particular spot, position on the floor, in this sense, character, than the average person would. And you have to kind of be cognizant of that.
Yeah, I agree with that because, for example, if you take Tracer and compare Tracer, what people or pro players know about Tracer now, back to, when the release happened, there were no players that knew how to think about the recall. And if you try to explain, like, you have to practice three-dimensional thinking, for example, or assumptions, there's no way to train that efficiently as well either. And the tendencies players would have, for example, some players would tend to shift blink, some players would blink with their mouse instead, and you can actually see a sort of form of body language in game. For example, when you watch a top-down VOD and you see a diva looking at some team member, and you can see sort of the direction. With the OWL top-down VODs, we can see the actual direction they look at, and you can see who they might communicate with. And when you see like small tendencies like that across multiple fights, you can figure out who the team leader is in the game. You can figure out how the temperature in the enemy team is or our team is, and you can basically read your opponent's minds because they express what they're thinking in game. And if you have a DPS that's popping off or going ham, he will show it. Like, he will take the greedy angles, whereas if he feels defensive, he feels like he's struggling, he won't take those angles unless there's always people who don't realize what they're doing. For example, if you play any quick play game, for example, you have players stepping out of position 24/7, but in pro play you get punished and you learn very quickly by trial and error.
Yeah, I have actually very cool anecdote about that very thing, which I heard from Siegel, and was basically, you guys were playing King's Row against NYXL, and he was on Genji, and I think it was first, and suddenly in some window Jonak shows up, and normally this would basically be a death sentence to Zenyatta in that regard, but Siegel thought to himself, okay, this is not Jonak-esque. This has to be a tell. And it turned out they actually had a Junkrat trap up there, and had Siegel dove through that window, I think he would have immediately been trapped up on dash and would have likely then lost the 1v1, obviously. So these little tells, and then also the story is that Siegel didn't end up taking the bait, right? So these little tells keep happening also with Reinhardt shatters, for instance, where sometimes you see the Reinhardt, nervously shuffling because they're like 3% away from the ultimate. But the opponent, Reinhardt, knows, okay, if he had shatter, I would be dead now, or I would have to do something else. But the body language of that tells me I can still go ham for like that fraction of a second or that swing, and might change the fight outcome in that. Do you think that happens a lot now?
Oh, definitely. Just another small example. This is one is really obvious though, but Reinhardt, for example, when they before they move out, let's say they have just wiped their team and they're moving up, and Reinhardt happens to be the first one in front of a choke. If you see a Reinhardt swinging into the wall, it doesn't really mean much, but you can understand with your intuition that he's probably waiting on his team or shield to recharge, or maybe something else. But you can see a Genji who sits on an edge or something. He's not gonna shift in and blade blindly into a team. Instead, he's just waiting for an opportunity for the team, to come in. And just as you say, like with the Junkrat trap, it's it keeps happening, but it's also really hard to spot it out sometimes. For example, you can't notice everything all the time, but that's why I mentioned that you learn really fast with trial and error, because the games are so important that you can't afford to not learn.
There's also one very cool observation I made in language, which is basically, I used to listen in, or like when you heard people, especially in EU, play, and sometimes they used to stream these tournaments. If you listen to the comms, for instance, if people were playing Valutaya, it wasn't actually that they said Tracer behind. They did that for every other team, but with Valutaya, they said Valutaya behind, because that was a very different quality or play style in comparison to other Traces, because I think what was explained to me was that his blink management was so tricky that he could do stuff that most other Tracers couldn't, and teams really had to adapt to that specific thing, where he could just one-clip your Zenyatta if you didn't pay attention. And that sort of like, by saying Valutaya, it apparently triggered, like, because these people kept losing to United, this like triggered this response of, oh yeah, it's not Tracer. My Zenyatta can't actually win that 1v1. I guess I now have to help, right?
No, I definitely agree. Back when I was with Misfits in Apex Season 2, the first time I realized that was when Munchkin in scrims, he would, pop up, and then instead of saying McCree is flanking or over there, you say Munchkin, because that guy, he's gonna headshot you instantly unless you punish him. And I think it's because players instinctively value the person much higher than the others, and that's like a way to just give a signal that this is of higher importance than anything else right now, and it's not the normal scenario with this kind of theory, like this is a special case and we need to deal with it right now, like that kind of feeling.
Okay, so obviously the only people who really seem to believe that there's a path from complete rank amateur to pro is Blizzard, when they try to sell the whole path to pro aspect, make random players believe that, if they get high enough rank, they'll get in a team, and then they'll go through their team through open into contenders. And, like at the moment, we've yet to really see that kind of open up as a path. So my question is this: when you bring in young players, newer players, inexperienced players who haven't been in either much of contenders or have never played in Overwatch League, do these kinds of core concepts we're talking about, like interactions between specific heroes and other heroes and how the comps work, is the learning curve steep for that sort of thing if they've just been playing in quick play or whatever it might be?
It's extremely steep. It's basically like learning a whole different language or new way of thinking, because if you play ranked, you might have the experience of working with different teams. You might have experience from different cultures, background, different players, etc. But you don't have experience with one set of players that you work with and that you stick with through thick and thin, basically. Where if you encounter a problem, like early on in Overwatch, you would have a meltdown, if it doesn't get solved. But you actually have to work with the problems you get. And for some newer players, they will get, I'm gonna phrase this like a bit rougher than it might sound like, but they will get eaten up basically because they don't have the, so to say, skin in the game where they can expect what kind of comments or, expectations that the teammates might have on your ideas or your results, for example. And the same, you might not expect the thoughts you might get from your future self, basically, when you sit there with a team. And some players, they have no experience and then they come in and they just fit amazingly. But those are the players that adapt and learn quickly, or not adapt, but learn quickly. And they would learn quickly in any field. They would learn math, they would learn music quickly as well. But going path to pro from rank to straight into OWL, it's going to be really rough. And it's a lot of self-insight that needs to be done for the younger players, because that's why I posted an article about how to negotiate better for yourself in teams, because there's a lot of players that do anything for a spot and then they end up doing stuff they don't like. And later down the line, it's going to affect the teams they are in because they are unhappy. And if they are unhappy, the teams become unhappy and so on. So yeah, that's my take on it.
That's also why sometimes if your star player in Overwatch tends to be the shy guy that doesn't really, force the others to play around him as much, that's a surefire way, once that shifts out of meta, that works, that your performance completely goes out of the window. Because I would call out Florida Mayhem for that, when basically the way Logic used to play wasn't asked for, or it seemed to be the case that they forced Logix into a more passive role where he couldn't play his playstyle anymore. And now you could say that the solo Tracer style lost appeal anyway, and it didn't work as much for a fact either anymore, because certainly flex supports get better at dueling and whatever, and also obviously main supports get better at protecting them. But I felt like for large parts of the season, Logix felt or looked very harnessed towards a very specific playstyle, which is basically supporting the backline.
I think the supporting the backline was because there's, flanking with Tracer was much harder once Junkrat and so on came into the meta. And just as we talked before, like player tendencies, you would hear in scrims, for example, oh, this is Logix, or oh, this is Bunny, or this is much, the Tracer players. And then because you have scrimmed them so much, you memorize how they move and you can almost guess essentially where they are. But then you have Sabiolbi, who waits until his tanks come in, and then there's two people to deal with, and that's much harder than one person flanking.
Okay. One thing I want to ask you about was, in teams, how do they actually manage the communication hierarchy? Because I can tell you from other games I've been involved with, and especially games where I knew people who are coaches and I got to listen in on some of the sessions, one thing that was very underrated by the public, they didn't really seem to understand this, is they all thought that the best communication was like everyone basically acting as if their teammates were blind and they were just telling them everything they saw. Like, right, oh, I saw the guy there with someone behind me, like, rotate. And what I actually found was a lot of the good coaches, one of the first things they did is they tried to streamline comms, and they actually even told certain players who they just knew weren't very good at comming, like, don't comm that sort of thing, actually just leave that. And the principle sounds counterintuitive, but when I thought about it, it makes a lot of sense, because when I play myself in team games, probably the most frustrating thing is either when someone comms something that's like fairly obvious based on what they just said before, and therefore I would have come to that conclusion myself, or even worse, the ultimate cardinal sin in my opinion is where they only sort of half saw something themselves and they try to comm it, but obviously there's not enough time to be like, I sort of maybe saw him go back and I'm not sure there might be two people, because then if you take that in your brain as a real comm and you play it as if that is actually accurate and you die because they were wrong, that is probably the worst feeling in the game. Like, then you feel like it's your teammate who actually got you killed, it's not the other guy. Like, in that scenario, if the guy has imperfect comms, I'd sometimes rather he just didn't give me the comm and just let me work off the imperfect comms, and then I'll live with the result, if you get what I mean. So how do you approach that aspect? 'Cause it sounds pretty tricky.
It is tricky. I can say I haven't figured out the most optimal strategy for approaching comms or building comms, but I have very optimized way of looking at it so far, though, and it's that as basically halfway through the season, back to beta even, like that time span is basically all about shouting. You want to shout loud, you want to shout a lot, and when teams would say this is a vocal player, they mean he's a player who can shout loud, and people will not say no to him, because early on in Overwatch, it was really hard to direct a team into one idea and get everyone under the same umbrella. Because when you're under the same umbrella, you work amazingly together, but then you have the differences in cultures and all that. And some players, they would misunderstand, frustrations in game that aren't directly related to anyone in the team. It's more like when you shout and you basically spam the voice comms, you also have to set like a tempo for yourself, like internally. And for someone that shouts often, you also most likely will encounter tunnel vision or some form of tunnel vision where you get too focused on something and then you forget to expect some stuff in the game. For example, you don't expect a projectile coming from the left or right and then you die. And because you didn't have that expectation, you get frustrated. And the easiest way to ventilate that is by taking the first best problem to complain at. But the way you can deal with that is it depends completely from player to player, but you have to reach the player, basically understand what they think, and then you have to find out ways to narrow down like their reach, or so you don't want them to reach every corner of the room. Instead, you want them to have like a direct channel, and you also want to pace that so they don't go overboard and they don't say too little as well. But some stuff that you mentioned, don't say this or don't come that. Some coaches, they are overloaded with work as well, and they might focus too much on things not to do rather than things they should do more. And that's one thing that I look up to coaches, that they do. Like when they see one thing that a player does good or comes well, you want to make that player confident and you want to make them feel more trusting of themselves, basically. Because if they trust themselves with talking and they're a shy person, they will sort of break out of their shell and step up and become better than they already are. And that doesn't mean they will say more unnecessary stuff. They will actually say better stuff, and maybe not at a higher pace, but when it actually matters in a fight, if you say it once and you say it well, it doesn't have to be said twice or 3 times.
Would you say that's a fair summary of Harry Hook's development as a player in the Overwatch League, especially towards Season 4 now? That he because from what I remember, Aero saying he wanted Harry to be more vocal, or rather even the vocal leader, I guess.
Well, it also it makes sense to have him as the vocal leader. Like, it depends like how do you define leader, because being vocal doesn't mean you're gonna lead unless you have to express that you express leadership. Otherwise, people will still do their own thing. And I would say it contributed a lot to his development to focus on talking and also just how to say things sometimes. Because, for example, on the Mercy position, if you have res and you play in stage 1, for example, and you have 2 reses, instant reses, you have to be able to count enemy reses as well as keeping track of your own. And then you have to do a lot of things at the same time. And if you end up like tripping over your own steps, you will ruin a lot of the comp for your own team.
Mm-hmm. How that's actually develops into a question that seems to be almost age old now, as old as Overwatch basically is. Obviously, in other games, it feels like they have a much more designated shot caller. So if I say who's the in-game leader of X CS team, probably everyone is going to be able to give me a straight answer for the vast majority of teams. Now, in Overwatch, that doesn't seem to be that, or it is rather hard to do, because it seems like most teams split responsibilities. And even with them, there doesn't seem to be a clear structure where you can say, okay, it needs to be the main tank, needs to be the main support, and it needs to be the flex support or whatever. So the last conceptions I've heard from especially the Korean coaches was they like to have the flex DPS call, they like to have the flex support call, and they like to have the flex tank call depending, or that was, I guess, the last meta application. And then also if they play Brigitte, they also like to have her call a lot of the stuff, such as stuns and whatever. Has that changed over the season, or do you think like now we can finally sort of like fundamentally say, okay, we know what Overwatch is like, these roles need to be called in?
I think for them specifically, one of the reasons they might feel like that is because they shift their main tanks. And if you shift the main tank, you can't really have him as the core caller. And I don't think it has to be a specific role. Overwatch is way too fast to have the same type of role as in CS. But in CS, you also have an in-game leader that actually directs the team and points, where to go and when to go. In Overwatch, you have much less planning before matches. For example, some teams, they don't even watch VODs. And then to blame, on not calling enough or anything, sure, they might, everyone might feel the same type of problem or they don't see another solution. But everything comes down to planning outside of the game in the end. And if you can plan, you don't even need comms. Theoretically, you can beat any team without comms, of course. But if you, for example, sit down with the team and plan out, okay, when I play Tracer, I can't really call because I have to focus so much that I become silent. I can't be aware of everything. I become basically like autopilot playing, but I do everything that I should do automatically. However, for a flex tank that has more downtime, they can go back into the, becoming conscious about the game or knowing exactly what happens and registering that. Those players that have downtime, they will be better callers than, for example, the hit scan DPS or main tank that plays Reinhardt and can't see anything, etc. But you still have these things like Reinhardt camera. You have players that turn really often and still make calls. There's players that make calls on Widow, make calls on Tracer, Genji, etc. So it's definitely not limited to flex roles.
Do you have like a conception or some like overarching archetypes, if you want, for what kind of callers that are there? Because I've heard people say, okay, he's the target caller, and that's what they framed the role as, or he's the ult tracker. Are these concepts still holding up, or do you have another conception of those?
I think they evolved basically, because ult tracking back in the old days of Overwatch would mean you keep track, but it also indirectly means you're the one that should make the plans for the ults, or you should start the discussions. And you also don't really need to call the targets. You would usually have 2 or 3 people calling at the same time in most teams I've been in. But it's not because I wanted it to be like that. It's just the way the players have learned it, and it's very hard to rewire the complete structure within a month or 2 months. So I would say, for example, sorry, I lost the topic. What
archetypes of types of callers? What?
Yeah. So there's the type of callers that are very direct, but also there's no positive or negative tone in it. So they're almost monotone, but they are loud and commanding basically. But then there's also those that are yelling almost, and they are commanding but also very clear, and they also very decisive. So I'd say there's different variations of explosive, and also I don't know the word for opposite of explosive, but that are very intact, or if that's a good word. Calm. Yeah, calm basically, because you have the Boston basically that are extremely calm, and I really like their comms, but it might not be what some other players want or can work with. So you have to obviously adapt that.
Okay, I thought as one last topic to open up would be one of the things which Initially, I think a lot of people, when they saw that there's 12 spots on an Overwatch League team, perhaps like me, naively thought, that's too many. Like, you don't really need 12 players. Like, I know personally, coming from Counter-Strike, I actually thought to myself, I don't think people are even going to use these subs, because once you've got your 6 players and you really know that they're all really good and the chemistry's good, you wouldn't want to risk subbing people in now. Now, obviously, that's very naive because there's different game modes, different heroes come into viability. But actually, what we've seen as the split, as the stages went by and by, is that it became even more important to have a deep bench, because when the big meta shift came, all of a sudden, even a star player might have to leave the game during certain points in time, or someone else might have to enter to play a niche hero that no one else was playing before. And so by the end, even though a lot of people couldn't have planned explicitly for it, we saw that a lot of the deep teams were the ones that ended up having the best or average success aggregate across all the stages. So do you have a sense for what should be done in that sense? Like how many players you should have, or should you have, for example, like, a cookie cutter approach? Like, right, I always try to have 4 DPS players and 2 healers and 3 tanks. Should there be like a set amount? How do you think people should structure that? Because obviously it's an aspect which over this season at least had a lot to do with the results.
If I'm allowed to, I would take 12 players, and I would make it so that both of them can scrim, but they don't have to scrim each other. I want to have a set of players that are consistent in the matches during whatever meta there is, because I think everyone in OWL can say this, that the less you switch, the less you switch players. The less you switch players, the less you switch strategies and so on, the more consistent results you can pull out, the better quality in general. And it doesn't become a game about memorizing a strat or something. It becomes a game of optimizing whatever you have. And if one team works on one meta, you can have another team working on whatever future meta there is. You can have upcoming players. You can have coaches that you want to train, and you use them to work with the other team, and then as well transit them into the main team. And you need some form of way to cycle talent, both for coaches and players. And what do you do if you have a player that steps out of line? Well, you have to de-escalate, the situation and deal with it somehow. And if it requires a bench, then you need someone to fill in his spot, and you need to have someone that's ready for it and that's motivated for it, and that can also understand the thinking of the person is replacing as well as the team is coming into. Because if you're a player and you get swapped in, fresh off the bench after game 2 in a match, and you've lost 2 maps in a row, it's really, really hard to lift the mood in a team, in a team environment where you've just lost two matches and you're coming in cold and everyone else is warmed up but still feeling down. You need someone that can be ready for that, both mentally and actually can perform as well.
Yeah.
What do you think, Yiska?
I always have to remember what basically Jack said in the very first interview after they've obviously won the Overwatch League, and was something like, to go to 12 players again, and he basically said that he would never make that mistake, he said. So I think what he experienced is probably like a clash of egos. If you have 2 world-star teams, and they basically came in, obviously it's very, very good players, and he said that he considered that all of them should have been starters in the Overwatch League. And I think it's very hard to make a case that any of those players that were on the London Spitfire wouldn't have started at least for some team in the Overwatch League. After all, we have Shanghai Dragons in the Overwatch League. But I think the problem really becomes then that you almost need to teach them in the art of Zen Buddhism, where they can, get rid of their ego and then just work in these systems where it can be hard. I would think, especially for certain player types, to sort of keep in check and then be there when they're needed. So we've seen that, for instance, with Fissure and Rascal and the Spitfire, who rather quickly left because they wanted to play as much as possible, right? So that again loops into the discussion of like what kind of player archetypes do you really want in the coming season? Because I think in almost all other esports, a combative superstar is still very valuable, while in Overwatch it seems like coachability is so much more important than in other esports. Would you echo that notion?
I would say that a player being coachable, I wouldn't take a player based on how coachable they are, because if they do my work for me, like I might not as well be in the team. So like I'd rather take a player that is better and that I can still work with, but might be harder for me to work with. But that's where my skill comes in and where what I've learned. And for example, I think the mistake with London, for example, in the early stages was that it's not easy to just take two different teams that competed against each other that have different mindsets and also like collective mindsets, and then try to mesh that. Like that's basically trying to mesh two different cultures into one and expecting that it's going to be easy and going to work. It's essentially like culture in any team, and I started valuing culture so much more in stage 3 and 4 because I could see hands on like how different players from different backgrounds interact with each other and how easily misunderstandings can happen just from wording things differently or have different accents or dialects or using a different set of vocabulary. But I would agree that a coachable player is still important, but not as important for me as the general public makes it sound like.
Because I do think that like this is obviously to me an area where no one's really figured out how you do this. But to tie in everything that you just said, you and Yiska there, on the one hand, if someone is like Fischer, as an obvious example, where they're so good that they're not going to just sit on the bench, in that kind of a scenario, it means that if you listen to players like that and you let them go, you're going to only end up with players on the bench who are inferior. And the problem then is when you then put them in the game, except for very extreme circumstances, it's not really going to do that much more for you, except if they can literally play a hero that no one else can play. And so the real issue here is, on the one hand, you have to find a way to keep this guy able to be on a bench at some point in the season and not playing, but still not, like letting his skills degrade. Because if somehow you can be both a very good team and have a guy who's actually legit really good, but is willing to sit on the bench, that is actually like sleeper OP quality to have in a team. If you have a guy who can then come in and add a whole new extra dimension and make you more dangerous in that respect. But I mean, it's obviously a lot easier to say that than it is to actually create a team in which that would work. Because at the moment, I don't really see how it can. Like, I feel like a lot of players, given the option, will just go and be a starter for the worst team rather than the backup for the best team.
Yeah, I think we can, or not we, but teams can reach that state. So for players where I'd say a player that goes to the bench and feels threatened, if it happens with more than one player, it's not his fault. It's kind of like sitting in a class, and if a teacher fails the entire class, it's his fault.
Yes.
But I'm not saying it's, I'm not pointing fingers here, but I'm saying that it's best in general to focus on the player that is the most productive and has the most, results produced, rather than focusing on those that might get, pressured by the star player or something, because the players that might feel pressured or might feel outrun or like they're running behind, sort of, or trying to catch up with stress, or if it's skill or whatever, they will advance faster than it will. Than the time it will take for a player like Fischer or whoever to become more fluid or whatever, because a star player is already set in stone, and once it's like hardened, it's really hard to make it moldable again, like a young player or fresh player. Whereas a fresh player, you can mold them basically because they don't have their full personality developed. They don't have much experience beforehand, and you can sort of put them in a good start rather than having bad start somewhere else and then PTSD or whatever, remembering flashbacks to bad situation and then letting that affect the current team. But I think it's almost a bliss to have like a star player that's willing to sit on the bench, because that's a sign of someone being very selfless, and it's a very good quality.
Okay. Right, Yiska, do you have a final thought on this one so we can wrap it up, because I'm getting tired now?
Sure. I guess one last question would be, so let's pretend for that you get the head coach position of one of the expansion slots. So you obviously already said that you would probably go with 12 players. Are there any other underlying concepts that you learned over the season where we would say, I would do this, and I think this has a high probability of being successful in terms of how do you build the team? What kind of star players can you get, and how many players and how much staff possibly also do you get?
I would delegate as much as I can, basically, because for example, I realized that it doesn't matter who has the right idea or who has the right suggestions, whatever. It doesn't really matter as long as everyone is on the same page. And I would want to work on setting up like a staff, where you can give an assistant coach type A of work and another one type B, and then they do that work. They come back with findings. Here, I found this. Okay, and then you have players as well giving their input and so on. And you want to have empowering, is that you want to empower your staff, and you want to empower your players, and you want to pick the players that respond well to that, and you want to start off focusing on creating a culture where you focus on winning rather than winning as a team, rather than winning personally or not losing your spot, or every man for himself, etc. And I learned that it might feel very rough sometimes when you lose games, and it can easily shift into, am I gonna keep my job or not? Should I train harder, more? You should already, when you're winning, that's when you should be training the most, not when you're losing, because when you're losing and training even harder, you're putting even more stress on yourself, and you might not even pick a win up, and then you end up miserable. So I would also account for those situations a lot, and making sure that the people I pick for assistant coaches or players are the type of people that I can vision in those scenarios and not break down, basically.
This video was kindly supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Eddie Wingfors, Daniel Yordanov, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, Kyla Harris, James Harding, Cesar, and special thanks go out to Matt Shakowski and Jerky's Minion in particular. Want teasers for my upcoming content? How about asking me a question for my monthly AMA? Do you want to take part in a discussion about esports with me? How about suggesting a topic or a guest for my content? Put your money where your mouth is and join the Scrilluminati today.